Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'd like to share today some thoughts on service based on my personal experiences. Perhaps the most obvious example of service in my life was my 2-year term in the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is a government program created by John F. Kennedy that sends volunteers to developing countries across the world. Volunteers are placed in communities and work with local residents on improving a variety of arenas: health, agriculture, education, entrepreneurship, and others. The Peace Corps pays volunteers close to what a poor resident of the area would make. The idea is that volunteers conduct a sort of cultural and technical exchange, showing people across the world America's talent and goodwill. On September 16, 2008, the day after Lehman Brothers closed and parted the opening shots of the Great Recession, I boarded a plane to El Salvador, a small country in Central America. I was to be a youth development volunteer. I joined the Peace Corps after spending a year as an AmeriCorps volunteer, another federal program that sends volunteers across the United States to team with local governments and nonprofits. For my AmeriCorps experience, I was in Seattle teaching GED to homeless youth. It was an amazing experience, one that convinced me later to get my master's degree in education, but my desire to see the world was still strong, and I wanted more adventure. So there I was. When my fellow volunteers and I arrived in El Salvador, we spent the first 2 months in an intensive training. Every day we received instruction in the Spanish language, Salvadoran culture, and our volunteer program. As a youth development volunteer, I was to be placed in a rural school, most likely focusing on teaching English and computer skills. At least that's what they told us. We had no control over where in the country we were placed. Upon completing training, I learned I was to be placed in a small community of about 500 residents called El Pital in the western edge of El Salvador. I would work primarily with a K-9 school. I would make $300 a month and live with a well-respected family in their adobe home. My fellow volunteers and I were, for the most part, young, idealistic, and ready to serve. We had joined to change the world, to get our hands dirty, to live in mud huts with no electricity, not to mention Wi-Fi, in the middle of the savannah, greeting villagers who would offer us spiced tea, and you get the idea, right? We had so many illusions, and who could blame us? Who else signs 2 years of their life away with so little guaranteed? So it was to my great surprise when the director of the Peace Corps gave us our final instructions. We were to spend our first 2 months of our 2-year term doing absolutely nothing. He told us sternly, no projects were to be begun in the first 2 months, no exceptions. That night, a group of us volunteers gathered in the town's plaza and fumed. Of course we would begin working once we got there. If need be, we just wouldn't tell anyone. Who would know? Our time was too valuable, the needs too great, the poverty and violence too astounding to just sit there. What could he possibly be thinking? Once I arrived in El Pital, I tried quickly to get my bearings. I met with the school's director, the village council, and the mayor of the larger municipality. I scribbled down notes and started using my training, brainstorming projects and identifying needs. The school's teachers didn't know how to use computers. The town had few planned activities for young people. There was no meeting house. The town's coffee and corn and beans were sold at embarrassingly low prices. No one knew English. I began planning budgets and campaigns, and I made a plan to visit every single house, over 120 of them, and map them all out in a huge poster attached to the wall of my room. At first, I attempted to add some order to the long, hot days by visiting houses one half of the day. I would try to get through 5, often simply walking from house to house, announcing myself and my organization, and asking for help. Many times, residents were gone to the fields or involved in the labors of the house, washing clothes by hand, grinding corn, taking care of children. They would offer me a plastic chair, of which only God knows how many are scattered across the world, and we would sit on the porch and talk. It took so long for me to slow down, to shut up, and listen. It took so long for me to stop worrying about how to help these people and try to start to understand them. I don't know when exactly it happened, when the switch from helping to knowing flipped, but I'm sure it occurred while sitting on a plastic chair on a dirt porch. When I first arrived to El Pital, I knew that the most valuable thing I could share was my knowledge. After all, I was a smart American, the luckiest of all the world. It took me a long time to realize that the people of El Pital did not care about my knowledge, at least not right away. They just wanted me to drink a cup of coffee with them, to listen, and to accept the food they'd offered. They wanted to trust me, and trust comes with love, and love comes with listening and with time. I ate dozens of tamales and drank way too much coffee, and I rambled up and down the hills of that village. I was worried people would see me as lazy, as a free rider, as a hippie who had come to go native. But I learned to quiet those voices and listen. I began to see why my director was so wise when he told us to spend the first 2 months doing nothing. I began to realize how hard it is to do nothing. It's hard work. And I began to realize how my idea of service was mixed up as saving people, as emergency, as action. That idea of service is often quite wrong. Instead, I began to understand service as something quieter, slower, and symbiotic. I stopped listening in order to figure out how to fix everyone's problems and started to just listen. Instead of looking down at them with the idea that I could make their lives better, I tried to get to know them. The power balance shifted when I observed the beauty of their well-tended garden or forgot my self-importance enough to relent to the heat and stay 15 minutes longer, to stay for dinner, to join their kids playing soccer in the yard. Over time, I began to visit fewer houses in a day. Instead of 5, I gradually settled on a single house a day, often staying for an hour or more. Finally open to seeing them fully, no longer focused on their deficits, I was able to see more about who they were, what mattered to them, and what they had to teach me. This helped me become not just a better volunteer, it helped me become a better person, one more focused on solidarity than on charity. It's hard for me to overemphasize that last part and how big a shift it was for me. I'm reminded of a spring break trip I took during college to New York City. During my junior year at KU, I participated in alternative spring breaks, which focused on service learning trips. A Methodist pastor took us to volunteer in various soup kitchens and homeless shelters around New York City. It was my first experience with big cities and with big city poverty. I distinctly remember going to a church, a huge church in Manhattan, a church that served 3 meals a day to thousands of people in need. The church workers handed us plastic gloves and coached us on how to efficiently load their plates with food. We formed an orderly line, with guests helped along with red velvet cordon barriers, keeping them in a row. I stood there with plastic gloves and slotted spoon in hand, ready for action, looking up at an impressive golden altar. The disconnect, the division of power between helper and helped, powerful and powerless, was crystal clear. Later that same day, we visited a Catholic worker house. There were no plastic gloves, no cordons, no altar. The project of Dorothy Day at this home, for that's what it was, a home. Volunteers shared meals, nightly prayer, and rooms with their, what to call them, guests, customers. They were more than that. They were equals, all seated at the same table, germs forgotten. Fellowship, solidarity. The director of that house was a Harvard graduate. I remember asking him why he chose a career that paid nothing after attending Harvard. His answer was for me to read Matthew 25. The idea of service as action, as doing something instead of listening, of service as charity instead of solidarity is ingrained in our culture. Can't I just donate some cans and get this errand over with? Quick, kids, clean out all the clothes you don't want so that we can donate them. Do you have any change? I can drop that in the man's styrofoam cup while we're stopped at the stoplight. While hard to argue against, I can't say that these gestures comprise service. Brett Kavanaugh is a judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., and is President Trump's second nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court. These nominations now involve quite the PR tour, as administrations work to promote their nominee as the most wholesome, honest judge in the land. The day after our president nominated Judge Kavanaugh, He was photographed serving lunch to hundreds of homeless in D.C. The intended message of the photo was clear. Here was an honest man dedicated to serving his community. He had a Catholic Charities hat on. He also had on plastic gloves. What would the message have been if the photo instead showed the judge seated at a table, sharing the same food he was serving? Would he eat it? Would that message have made some of us uncomfortable? This shift in my idea in service in El Salvador was hard because it tore down my presumed authority as a volunteer from America. When I first looked at the people of El Pital, I looked at them as people to be saved, my customers, my projects. As a citizen of the best and brightest nation in the world, I knew what they needed. America was the winner, they were the losers, and I could help them win. It was that simple. This helped me feel good about myself. It helped me stay confident. Peace Corps volunteers who thought this way would often congregate in the capital every month or so, binge drinking, smoking, and trash-talking their communities as full of backward hicks, ignorant campesinos who would be so much better off if they just listened to us and did things like Americans. Sound familiar? Many of us swear the poor would just be better off if they could just learn the value of hard work, if they could just get off their butts and clean up their front lawns and fix their cars, then they deserve health insurance. Leaders who limit ATM withdrawals for welfare recipients or say they can't buy soda with government money seem very comfortable in their position of moral authority. I learned to stay away from those meetings of volunteers, just as years later, I learned to stay away from the teacher's lounge during lunch. The toxic power dynamic of helper and helped often destroys any real connection between two human souls. The best volunteers I ever came across in the Peace Corps were those who grew to deeply love their community and began to see themselves as part of it. They learned to love their community members because of time spent rambling up and down hills, chatting on porches, watching sunsets, playing soccer, watching the coals die down under the stars. There's no way to rush that. It takes time. And love is a prerequisite for true service. You can't love what you don't deeply know, and you can't serve someone you don't love because you'll have no idea what they really need. And oftentimes, that love transforms both for the better. I know it did me. While I left El Pital changed, it's still hard for me to be patient. I wish I remembered the lessons of my time in the Peace Corps more often. I have trouble slowing down. There's so much to do, so little time. Even in my new job at the Iowa Register, it's hard. I have so many ideas. We've got to move now. But my time in the Peace Corps showed me that serving a community means first becoming part of it. I learned to love Salvadoran culture, its flaws included, and in seeing contrast was able to better examine my own culture. I was never more patriotic than when I was abroad, but I was also better able to see what another culture could teach me and share what lessons I could once I saw the differences between us clearly. That takes time and vulnerability, and plastic gloves are designed to limit vulnerability. To serve well, one must be willing to be vulnerable. One must be humble. I learned this in the classroom, too. In my 6 years at Wyandotte High School in Kansas City, Kansas, I noticed that year after year, fresh-faced teachers, often 22 years old, just barely above the age of their seniors, would arrive ready to save the urban poor. Oftentimes, they had very clear ideas about what our students lacked and little idea of what strengths our students possessed. And year after year, those teachers burned out and left, discouraged by the myriad of factors keeping families in poverty and schools unable to be the safety net and bridge they need to be. Other teachers thought these kids simply couldn't learn, whether because of their parents or their poverty or their ethnicity. They often taught their students very little. According to them, the reasons were simple. They just needed to listen to their teacher better, and they would succeed. Failure was explained as stubbornness, ignorance, and unfortunately, many teachers' deep-seated belief that certain cultures didn't properly value education. These teachers saw their students as other people's children. They were those kids. And once the day was done, teachers would hop in their cars and drive 30 minutes to a suburb in a different world. Teachers who believed in their students, who saw themselves in their students regardless of race or class, and at the same time could recognize their differences, those teachers changed lives. The teachers who said my kids or our children were successful. They saw the strengths these kids had in knowing two languages, in navigating different cultures, the victory of coming to school every day in spite of no electricity in the house. They celebrated kids and valued them. They loved them. A great teacher, Herbert Cole, wrote that kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. For 6 years, I gave that my all, and the impact those kids had on me also leaves me at a loss for words. They have made me a better person. These themes have followed me throughout my life. When I taught GED, students who the system had labeled losers and dropouts often were simply misunderstood, their talents ignored, their gifts unpolished, and their voices muted. I have learned to ignore anyone who calls anyone else a loser, as such a comment shows an inability to grasp that we're all in this together. If they're losers, there are losers, and we're bound to and responsible for them. In fact, it seems to me that Jesus was terribly interested in breaking bread with the downtrodden, not on lecturing or shaming them. He seemed to serve the marginalized by loving them, by telling them that their lives mattered. A society that only listens to the voices who have the most power does so at its own peril. But we do this all the time. In fact, and this is my last point, I think I do this in my own home. Lately, I've been thinking about service in my own family with my wife and son. How can I best be of service? I think immediately of things to be done. Yet often I think my wife's deepest wish is that, as silly as it sounds, I'd just turn off the computer and sit down and watch a movie with her. That I stop working or reading or cleaning and just relax on the couch with her. The dishes can wait. The grocery store will be open at 6 a.m. tomorrow. My instinct is to look at that as wasted time. I'm obsessed with productivity, but often productivity is not service. Service is love. Love means knowing, listening, being together. And I think of my son. How can I best be of service to him? Certainly he needs clean clothes and food and shelter, and forgive me for showing my inexperience in fatherhood here. He's my first one. I'm often shocked by how often he just needs me to sit on the floor with him. We'll read books, sure, in a minute. No focus on motor skill development or whether he says enough words. Serving my son is embarrassingly simple, but often I'm horrible at it. It's been 10 years since I began my service as a Peace Corps volunteer. I'm still proud of the love I have for those people and they for me. I'm proud that I still am in contact with the family who housed and fed me for 2 years, that we exchanged photos of our children on Facebook. I'm proud that I visited my village every single time I've gone back and visited some of my friends here who now live in the United States. I'm proud that I have their numbers in my phone and their messages on my computer. I'm so much more proud of that than the projects I completed, the reports I used to justify my time there. I'm brave enough to even avoid mentioning the projects I did there as an attempt to prove that I actually did something. If we want to talk about service, the service we find in our readings today, those numbers don't matter. If we want to talk about the GED instruction I did and whether it was successful, the teaching I did for 6 years and whether I made an impact, the time I spent in El Salvador and whether it mattered, numbers can't answer the questions our scriptures ask of us today. Service is a matter of the heart, of relationships, of love. I am learning to ask the right questions. I'm trying. Thank you.